I've been teaching for about 12 years now and teaching at Auckland University for 2.5 years. The first course that I ran here is your traditional lecture style, so 2-hour lectures, 1-hour workshop later on in the week. I turn up, you've got 250 people, you give them the content, you try and engage the class in as much discussion as possible, between individuals and with myself. And then you go through and do exercises on, say, a Thursday or a Friday for another hour or maybe a couple of hours as well. So that's your real traditional way of teaching. It's a way of teaching that I became reasonably comfortable and familiar with, but it's still a passive learning experience to a degree from the student's perspective. I mean, you can try and engage as much discussion and debate as you can, and that's one of the things I really like to do in class. But structurally, it's really challenging to do with that many students and in that type of environment where you have one person in the middle, 250 people kind of listening to this one particular person and furiously writing down notes. So it's a really applied context. So they're not only just learning about concepts and theories and frameworks and models and then somehow theoretically applying them to some made-up situation or example, they're actually really engaging with this material that they've learned, then essentially applying them to about as realistic a simulation or a scenario as you possibly can get. From the teaching perspective, it's an entirely different way of teaching, but I actually learned a lot more. I was there was lots of uncertainty from the teaching perspective on this, because normally you want to offer them stuff. This time I wasn't offering them so much, more around guiding them around particular frameworks and ideas they could try and implement to try and do better in the simulation and also learn a lot more out of it. It's a really interesting course, and I had about 102 students that were engaged in it this time round. This is the first time that I'd actually run the course, and at the outset I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. I initially thought that it was going to be more around decision making, strategy and those types of things. The idea was that lecture time and lab time was primarily for the teams to meet, make their decisions, talk about a few things and try and figure out what their strategy is moving forward. Every Tuesday, I would say between 80 and 95% of the class turned up in their teams. So the attendance was there, the engagement was there. So there's two key pieces of assessment. 20% of the mark is for how their company performs in the MikesBikes simulation. And I think that added to the competitive spirit of the class and the many hours that were put in. The final 80% is actually their summative learning journal, which is around 2,000 to 3,000 words. And that's the piece where they need to come up with 2 or 3 key learning points or learning outcomes that they've achieved from the course by reflecting back on their weekly journals, reflecting back on the readings, and just really coming up with something meaningful that they can take away from the course. Hands down, the favourite aspect from my perspective was the level of engagement and interaction with the teams. I was able to have my finger on the pulse throughout the entire semester because of the nature of the simulation, knowing that there were weekly goals that they had to achieve and weekly decisions they had to make. The students aren't just applying principles, concepts, ideas and theory to some context that they've thought over, a case study or something that they're thinking about, but there's a genuine simulated experiential form of learning which actually does take place. And I haven't encountered too much of that in my past. The students have said how it has essentially been one of the best learning experiences they've ever had at university. Several students have told me that in the past couple of weeks they've used the simulation and their experiences in the simulation in job interviews as well.